thank you, first of all, to the Honorable Minister for taking the time to be here. What we hope to do here is kind of more of an open discussion, so we'll have time for all of you to also ask some questions. But just to kick it off, I'll start the question for not the Honorable Minister Nirmala Sitharaman, but the person Nirmala Sitharaman. So you've had a very inspiring journey over. If you followed your journey personally, over the years, with starting with your work and starting a school, going on to kind of the National Commission of Women, serving as a national spokesperson for the BJP, in which role, I'm sure many of you who have watched these debates would see that this, she brought thoughtfulness, also calmness, somewhat rare in those debates. And then, kind of as was already mentioned, the first woman Defense Minister of India, the first woman Finance Minister of India. So I'd like you to share a little bit about this journey, some takeaways, some challenges, maybe some surprises. If you can share some thoughts on that, that would be wonderful.
Very difficult to put in the form of a few sentences to answer this question, but yes, it's been a remarkable story for somebody who comes outside of Delhi, somebody who comes from South India, somebody who's not really been into politics for generations. So in many of these ways, yes, it was it continues to be a journey. But one thing which has kept me going, I suppose, is the support system which my party offers. We've had some exceptional leaders who were very good in supporting people like me. There are many others, not just me, many others who have come into politics, and because the leadership has been such that it was able to support, guide, mentor, and also lead and give opportunities. I suppose those are the few factors which explain growth in politics of people like me. So I owe it to all of that. Good mentoring, good leadership, good opportunities given, constructive engaging criticism, and in a political party to find all this. I'm indeed in the right place.
So we're sitting here in Silicon Valley, so let me ask a question where finance meets tech. And one of the, of course, big changes in the last few years has been around digital currency, cryptocurrency, blockchain, and so on. And most recently, in your most recent budget, there's been some policy measures in that, specifically in the form of the tax on earnings from these assets. So, just wanted to get a broader picture view from you of where do you think this whole area is going. What is India's policy position on this? If you can share some of that. Then.
Well, first of all, we recognize that there is a lot of potential and already well-grounded progress made in the distributed ledger technologies which are coming in, and the blockchain itself is so full of potential, not just in the payment arena, but also in very many others. So our intention is in no way to hurt these, or to even say that we don't need it, but to define for ourselves as to how we need them and in what ways their growth should be facilitated and how are we going to handle it. Because as much potential as it has for positive contribution towards the economy, it also can be manipulated for not so desirable ends, whether it is on money laundering or whether it is on leading towards financing terror. So these are some of the concerns not just India but many countries of the world have, and they are also discussed in global multilateral platforms, in meetings that the World Bank holds or in the meetings that IMF holds. these are already into serious debate. And also because the Bank of International Settlement, through their institutions which study such technologies, and also the financial stability bureau that they have, are all into understanding the progress that is being made, the collaterals that they may bring along, and therefore for every country which if there is impatience outside in the world saying, what are you doing about crypto? I can understand the impatience, but I'm sorry, that's how it is going to be. It'll have to take its time for all of us to be sure that at least with the given available information, we are taking a discerned decision. It can't be rushed through. So,
thank you.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, I think that's great. John, would you like to ask some questions?
Yes, and thank you for coming to Stanford. It's an honor for all of us who are here. So I have some questions about foreign policy and some questions about economics. Maybe I'll start with the foreign policy. But you just were in Washington, and there was a lot of publicity about a G20 meeting where some of your colleagues walked out and you didn't. It seemed quite tense. I've been in G20 meetings, but have never seen a walkout. Did you make any comments about that? Was this a just happenstance, or as a statement, or could you say anything about that?
Well, the walkout, yes, did happen. And there were some of us who did not walk out as well. It didn't seem like happenstance. So there's been some thought in deciding that they shall walk out indeed. But the provisions of G20, because the current chairperson also discussed with every one of the members, she discussed with me as well. Also because India now is in the Troika. G20 has something called the Troika of that country which holds the current chairpersonship, the one which held one before, and the one which is likely to hold next. So the three countries make a Troika, and there's greater consultation among them about logistics, about planning for a meet and so on. So in that regard, we were consulted as well by the current chairperson who's from Indonesia. Indonesia holds the chair. So even before the meeting could be held, the concerns that countries could walk out, the concerns that, is it possible to have, Russia not be invited, and so on, were discussed. But I think call has been taken that the G20 in its association, articles of association, or in its formation doesn't have anything which gives the chairperson the right to send out a member or not invite a member. So these are things which were discussed. So as a result, perhaps some of them decided to walk out. Not here, but certainly not in happenstance.
Okay, well, thank you for that. We never know exactly what goes on. But my second question is somewhat related, because we're a lot of talk in the United States. The Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense recently traveled to Ukraine, and there's a big question about Russia and their invasion. And maybe the big question is, will the sanctions work faster enough to combat the military? I think that we had a discussion yesterday with Condoleezza Rice, and that seemed to come out a bit. So I don't know. You're right there next to all that's going on. It must be on your mind a lot. These are economic issues, to be sure, that are related to the military. But do you have any thoughts about whether it's India's position or what we should be doing differently in terms of sanctions or anything else? It'd be terrific to hear.
Sanctions always have an impact on the economy of not just the country on which the sanction is levied, but also the collateral impact will be therefore many countries, many other countries to feel. And I suppose that is the situation even much more so now, because we are globally far more interconnected, much more than ever before. The interconnectedness through the digital era gives us great lot of advantage. And that advantage is there for all of us to benefit from. And that advantage should be built on. But that advantage also brings with it a collateral with a lot of unintended consequences. So for instance, if payments are affected because as a part of the sanction, SWIFT is also one of the instruments through which you impose the sanction, it can have collateral impact on many others on whom you probably didn't intend to have the sanction. So unintended consequences do bear immediate and strong impact on countries in this digitally connected world. So that is one thing which I think, when sanctions are decided to be imposed, this set of unintended consequences may have to be factored in from now when the decision making happens. That is one. I remember, therefore, the situation which has come about for many countries which were, well, I suppose that's a situation also with countries within Europe, where the dependence on certain raw materials or essential commodities, if probably are placed in one source, it does hurt you when situations change adverse to your priorities. Also, I suppose the pandemic has also shown us how, again, when supply chains are disrupted, because the source is from one geography, it hurts all of us. So India's position is not just for its economic interests, but also its security interests. The balance that India has taken in every one of the decisions in this context has been very much because of the geopolitical location of India, because we share land borders with some of these countries. Because of the way in which over the decades India had to always defend itself when situations arose, much against its own interests, in its own land interests, border interests, its economic interests. India had to all the while take care of its interests, almost left to itself. So India definitely remembers those instances. But in a globally connected world, digitally connected world, remembering this is just not good enough. We'll have to work with the current situation as well. So we are quite conscious of that.
Okay, thank you for that. It's on our minds, that's for sure. Every day we see and we read about it.
Thank you.
While I'm on this topic, maybe this is a guess, but the U.S. basically withdrew from Afghanistan, and that's right and even closer to India. And I wonder, is it extensive? Do you think that was a factor in what's happening? Do you have any way to know from your perspective? Is that a factor in what's happened in Ukraine and Russia? I'm sorry, it's a hard question. I admit.
What happened in Afghanistan, I wish had happened a bit more with greater planning. It gave us an impression, and it could just be an impression. I concede that much. It could just be an impression. It gave us an impression that it was a hurried and hasty withdrawal, leaving a situation which was left to that region to handle. And in that region, we are very close in proximity, very close also to some ideological confrontation, not ideological as the current government, but ideological as India and its territorial integrity, which since the time we have become independent, the borders have always been one of the areas in which one or the other incursions had hurt us over the decades. And therefore, instances in the border. No, you're not going to hold it. So the instances in the border have always been, and this is something which Government of India has tried establishing with data, with facts, that the incursions have been enabled, emboldened, facilitated and armed by equipments and munitions from that side of the world, from the western, northwestern side of India. And when a hasty withdrawal happens, leaving majority of the stuff that you used to deal with the situation there, back there, and you come back physically. The ammunitions, the equipments, the logistical equipments which have been used, your trucks, your armaments, are all still there. And that is exactly what India has been always saying. Those, if left unattended, now it is left abandoned, can be used by those forces which can hurt India, which have been hurting India over the decades. So this withdrawal from Afghanistan appears, again I concede I may be wrong, but appears to be hasty, unplanned, and perhaps not keeping our interest in mind. And we are wanting to be your friends, you are wanting us to be your friends. And friends have been left with a problem which is like a hot potato to handle, and we are trying to handle that.
Thank you very much for that. I just say I spent time in Afghanistan when I worked for the U.S. government. It was a better situation. Yes, that's for sure. Let me ask maybe more economic questions, and these aren't easier, but it's closer to your responsibility. By the way, I think economics and finance and military and diplomacy go together, but this has to do with inflation. It's a big issue in the U.S. The Fed is meeting. Looks like they're going to move, but it's also global. And as you look around the world, you see to some extent there's a pickup in India as well. I know there's a Central Governor who's in charge of this, so to speak. But do you have any thoughts about both with respect to India and with respect to whether there's some adjustments that be made? I gave a talk, a Jha lecture 12 years ago with the Reserve Bank, and even then it was a question, could there be a more systematic approach? And if you have any thoughts about what we could be doing, because it's not just the United States, it's a global issue.
Yes, again, in this interconnected world, inflation spreads faster, quicker, and wider and deeper. This time around, the inflation is not just going to be because the Fed takes a decision to, regulate its economy and the situation in the US, and also ensure that the rate of interest is increased, which has been remaining low for a very long time. But also because globally there's a lot of dollar bills prevalent everywhere. So when you're a global currency, you also immediately leave imprints of every one of your decisions all over the world. But that alone is not going to be the issue of inflation. The inflation is now going to be largely because of the commodity prices, because of the essential commodities, even food grains becoming rarer. Ukraine, which was a large supplier of wheat, edible oils, is now in a disarray, so that space is left wide open, and not very many countries produce such quantities of wheat that they can fill in that space for the absence of grain. Although India, of course, is sitting over stockpiles of wheat and we want to export them. So that is going to cause both edible oils and also cereals to be more expensive. In this process also, you find repeatedly that the crude oil prices are not coming down below $100 per barrel. Remaining at that level is definitely going to heat up so many economies without doubt. India imports nearly 85% of all the crude that it consumes. And of the 85%, about 80 to 85% comes from the Middle East. I've said this before, about 5 to 7 comes from the United States. It's hardly about 3 to 4% which comes from Russia. So with the prices remaining high and with supplies also becoming constrained, inclusive of the natural gas, your inflation problem is aggravated. India suffered inflation-related issues periodically because we have a cycle of crops, and particularly the perishable ones suffer if there's excess rain or no rain, or if there's excess flooding, no flooding. So those always have had this problem, and the storage of such perishable commodities has never been the best of situations. So inflation causes worry. Natural gas supply causes worry because we wanted to transition from using coal to natural gas before we get into complete renewables. Even that causes worry because we've started using liquefied petroleum gas for domestic cooking purposes. Even that's going to affect us because we encouraged even the poorest of the poor households to say convert to using LPG because you can't be using wood and fossil fuel, coal and so on. And there was this impression, and to a large extent correct impression, that the Reserve Bank was more focused on growth because we were coming out of the pandemic and we had to recover, and the recovery was got to be consistent and sustained. And therefore there was this impression that the Reserve Bank was probably less attending to inflation and more attending to growth. But in the last Monetary Policy Committee, the Reserve Bank has very clearly indicated why they will not do anything to curb growth. They will now probably tilt somewhat towards attending to keeping inflation well within the 6% mark. So yes, the Reserve Bank has seized of it, spoke about it, and is also moving towards either addressing the inflation.
Okay, thank you. So I'm not sure of the timing, but
I have a couple more questions in here to ask.
okay. I have one more for the news. This is you're in the middle of Silicon Valley, and many of the firms are under attack on both sides of the political system for various reasons. And it kind of worries some. I don't know, is there a sense in which you think this is a problem for the world? Because these are high-tech firms that are all over the world. Is it welcome? Is it time to step back and say, do things differently? Or what is your sense of, are we getting it right in the U.S., or should we think more internationally about this? Any thoughts?
Let me come to this. I'm not sure as to what are the grounds on which they are being targeted from both sides. So my response would be therefore limited.
So the most common is they're too big. They've got controls.
Oh, that's
the most common is your gigantic firms. There's a lot of
the big
control,
tech companies.
prices, entry. And this is a change.
But they may be legitimate concerns. But I would think that the contribution that these startups or tech companies have done to the changing era which is moving from high-tech industry to now moving to Web3 kind of situation, and the contribution that they're making in terms of the innovations that they and such innovations we likely see for businesses and for even a common citizen are very transformational by their very nature. So I think if there are problems of them being too big, too all pervasive, and therefore probably giving a feeling that they are probably controlling many important aspects of our economy. Those concerns can be addressed, but I think contribution to the needs of our community. Thank you.
I'll switch gears from the macro topics that we're focusing on so far to some specific parts of the economy. So I know one area that kind of is of your interest is education, and obviously current role is role to play in kind of fostering that. My question was about, if you think about education and where we are sitting right now, it's an example of where generosity meets curiosity. It's not just at the higher education level. Universities in the US obviously have greatly benefited from people kind of giving money to foster it, but also at all levels, like government things, elementary school, the public school, and the money it raises from the community. So in India also there has been a tradition of giving. If you look at any small town, forget about the big institutions named after the Tatas and Birlas, but every small town will have a college, school named after somebody who's doing money. I wonder if you have some thoughts about, is there, at the same time, there's been questions about, there's a lot of new wealth that has been created in India. In fact, some people sitting here in this room have done that as well. At the same time, there is a sense that there's more potential for individuals who have created that wealth to also spread that through education. And I wonder, from a policy perspective, do you think India is in a good place in terms of fostering generosity, giving towards causes like education? Are there any thoughts in where this might go?
I think there's quite a lot of sense and thought among people who need a break in their businesses that they have to give back something to the community. Since I'm sitting here, I'm talking about people here, and you have to be a lot of people here in the Zoom itself who made it big. I met one such a person when I was that Sunday when I was about to go for the walk in one little shop I had gone to. An Indian origin who's made it big, whose children have also done very well. And she comes from sort of the part where I come from. It was all often blue when she met me. I said, I think I've learned enough. Now I want to give something. I've already started funding schools in that area from where they came from. And in all probability from this year, she would spend more time with her husband. Both of them would spend more time there to ensure quality education be made available to the tourists and also bring quite a few technologies which can facilitate education. So I've just taken that one example because there are people here of Indian origin who made it big and who are also thinking of education, of giving back. So that is one example that I've taken, but I can tell you of so many others who, whichever part of the world they are looking at giving back something to their communities, and education is one of the top points.
In terms of follow-up, my question was also about, is there anything that can be done from the tax policy standpoint to kind of make it even more attractive? Or do you think
80G is a provision under the Income Tax Act which gives tax concessions for people who do donations to institutions which are recognized as those who can receive these funds, which can put in money for public service and everything. There are enough and more provision already for seeking tax concessions for people who want to give money for such causes.
Another question, kind of switching gears a little bit, is that I saw an interview of yours talking after the budget, talking about some fundamental changes in the budgeting process. And one of the big things that you talked about and which is visible in the last few years is greater transparency in the whole budgeting process, the timing of the budget itself, and so on. At the same time, there's other parts of interaction with the government where people have complained of things going backwards a little bit. If you think about in the past, especially compared to China, there was always India had a reputation of statistics that you could trust that were reliable. So the question relates to for instance, the national sample survey. There's a question around that, poverty numbers around. Also, COVID more recently, there's the WHO and so on. So I wonder what your thoughts are about transparency in general, and how to kind of make this, increase the accountability. What explains this somewhat of at least from somebody looking from outside? On the one hand, you see the budget, on the other side, you see other things. What explains this dichotomy within, if you may, maybe it's just looking from outside, or at least what people have commented about, is that, what do you think, what is the policy especially, and what do you think?
I keep telling myself that I should give brief answers. This is not one of them. This is going to have to take a slightly longish answer. See, India is a democracy, and you have quite a few institutions within the government and outside of it which look at data. Second, India is also a federal setup where center and states have their own domain of working, and disclosure of data will have to come from states as much as coming from the center. Now, why do I have to say this? That there is a federal structure, there's a central government, and there are provinces which also have control over something. Data particularly. For instance, take the latest COVID pandemic. Health is a subject which is handled by the provinces. Health is a subject in which the last mile execution happens from the states. States have elected governments there. States have an assembly, which is like the parliament at the state level. Any legislative matter pertaining to that state will have to be within their domain. The budget is theirs. It all gets there legislatively from there. Now, if from COVID, if I take that as the first example on which I want to talk, if on COVID pandemic, for instance, death numbers are varying, are suspect, are being corrected over the period of time. And all of this put together is giving you a feeling that data is unreliable. I want to tell you that the data which the union government reports is a compilation of the data coming from the central states, the provinces. The central government does not have an authority to tinker with it. The numbers reported by the states are the ones whose parliament can be given or informed about on the table of the House. So if I gave a number X earlier, and now I'm saying, sorry, for that very period, the X is not X, but it is 3X. It's not me tampering. It is that some states have earlier given me a number which they thought they were right at that time, and which now, whatever be the reason, have said that time number was not 3, it is now 3X for that period. It doesn't make the union government's data bank suspect. It just is duly reporting what the states have given. So that's one, if you take the example of COVID. And why do some states have to correct it? Because COVID pandemic time, and I will say this for every one of the states, hospitals had only COVID patients in them. The hospitals could not risk having comorbid patients in the next ward, and this ward having only COVID patients, some of the doctors moving from here to there, and therefore they said, no, please, we admit only COVID patients, the rest of your people at homes. If there's an emergency, somebody will take care of you. Now, therefore, from the hospitals, the death data related to COVID patients. But some of the comorbid patients who were dying at home or who got admitted in a private ward or somewhere else were reported subsequent. So corrections are. Now, if a comorbid patient dying during the COVID pandemic itself, Is he dying, being comorbid, but out of COVID, or anything else? It's technical for the doctors to decide and place on record. So such corrections which have also happened because of these reasons. So the number is not suspect, but given the peculiarity of the situation and the fact that the center and state have to work together, data has changed. So that doesn't raise the question of suspicion, but it raises the question that timely understanding of the process itself will have to be there. Otherwise, we can always say, oh my God, this damn country gives you data which you can't rely on. I'm sorry, you've not understood my country's process. It's a democracy. I have to respect the elected government of the state as much as I have no business to enter into a terrain which, for the sake of authenticity of data, I can do anything with. No, I'm sorry, I can't. And therefore, I would think it's far more authentic to see the data which comes, because it has so many elected representative institutions participating. And that applies for education, that applies for many other things as well.
I have one question before we open it up to the audience for questions. They're sitting in the medical school, it relates to health. One of the successes in the last, during the COVID pandemic, was how India went about its vaccination program. Such a complex country, what it achieved has, I'm sure it has lessons. So I was wondering, from in terms of learnings from this kind of how this was managed, are there things that can be transferred more generally to improve the health system, the public health situation?
The big thing there is, like any other way, any other education activity that we've done was to bring in a big element of technology. The COVID management is something on which I would think the country can reasonably take pride in, because we brought in the COVID platform app, which registered every patient, their location, and helped when we wanted to have containment zones. Therefore, we could go to or pinpoint the PIN code, the postal index number code, and confine patients to that area. Also, when you gave the vaccine, you could say to the patient which is the vaccine you're taking, on which date it's going to be available for you. You can go to this particular nearest hospital which will give it to you. And on that day, you get one certificate saying you had one dose. Whether you take it as a printout or you leave it in your phone. And then the next dose is due so-and-so date after 90 days or 60 days. And on that day, you go get a second dose, and then you get a certificate again on your phone. And that second dose had to be necessarily the same vaccine which you had in the first dose. Mixing was not allowed, and that was confirmed by the fact that you were able to check it up on your phones itself. So that CoWIN app has played a brilliant role in identifying patients and treating them, giving the vaccine, and also certifying them, and also marking the duration between one to the other. That app is now made as a public domain property, which any country wants to use can use. So India normally does lead in app and software technologies and use it and also make it for public. India has put it out for any country which wants to use it. So the advantages that we've had of bringing technology, the experience shown, is now shared with everybody who wants to. We've done it with good work.
All right, we have roughly about 20 minutes, so let's start with a question.
Co-President of Stanford University. My question is around the recent merger between HDFC Bank and HDFC. Do you see this stopping more such mergers and acquisitions in the financial sector? If so, does it create more opportunities, or does it create systemic risk in the economy with these differential rates being leveraged by two different organizations? And the second question, someone from the tech world of Silicon Valley, huge believer in the transformative power of technology, and yet as someone who grew up in the backdrop of the Sabarmati ashram of Ahmedabad, I really worry that is technology creating a huge different kind of inequality and divide in the world. Also in India, particularly between rural and urban communities. Love to hear your thoughts.
No, the merger of banks, I think it's a good step forward, and it is going through all the process of the regulators. They are looking into it, and in principle, I think the merger has been done after due consideration of what regions they have. And it is a good step, as I said, because India needs a lot more big-sized banks to deal with scaling of issues in various sectors, whether it is energy, whether it is the green energy, renewable energy, or even logistics. India is spending a lot of money on building logistics sector or infrastructure funding. So, although we have now created an infrastructure sector, banking sector, so this merger is quite the thing which India needs now. I'm sure it's also getting good standards of regulation. On the digital divide, I agree during the pandemic, we have attempted to ensure that we continue education with children so that we don't lose out. We now ended up losing nearly 2 years of school. So we have taken up some steps, and to some extent, I would say it successfully reached many areas of the country, but it certainly did not reach some who could not afford to have these phones or other instruments which would have facilitated this. And that is why in this budget we have come up with an announcement that it won't be dependent on a phone, but the education can be available on a phone. Doordarshan, which is the official run of Indian television, which has various channels, we have now given 200 channels of Doordarshan so that it can be used for primary up to secondary high secondary learning as a supplement to the regular school, not that the schools are pursuing, as a supplement to learning, and also provided all the languages required. Third, also because when we do it through Doordarshan is a non-free paying channel which is now necessarily got to be broadcasted to all students, direct to home with the satellite connection. Even if you have a license, even if you don't have a license, you can get Doordarshan in television. So it will now be therefore. Doordarshan has always been cost-free, and it was necessary for all kinds of broadcasters to include Doordarshan in the bouquet of channels that we get, and therefore we thought bringing that innovative, even if the family did not have a phone, we would have at least a television. If not the neighbor will have a television, so it is possible for them to get education for free for the last 2 years in which we are trying to make. That's been announced